Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. Our guest today is one of the longest-serving justices in the history of the Vermont Supreme Court. Justice John Dooley retired in 2017 after serving 30 years on the High Court. He was involved in thousands of cases, including high-profile decisions involving civil unions, education funding, and fundamental rights such as freedom of speech. It is an honor to welcome the Honorable John Dooley to this desk. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Fran. It's a pleasure to be here.
And retirement a couple of years ago, but we still see you sitting on the bench. Is this common?
The extent of it is a bit uncommon. It got caused by the delay in filling the position of my colleague Marilyn Scoggin when she retired. And one of the other justices had some health issues that kept her off the bench for a while. So there were two vacancies essentially, and so they really needed help. And so a group of trial judges and Justice Scoggin and I helped out.
Stepped in, helped out. Said, well, okay, almost a volunteer thing.
Well, it essentially is a volunteer. I mean, they can't force you back, but we're delighted to do so.
They're
help.
Fortunate.
Yeah.
Well, there are plenty of legal issues to talk with you about, but I want to start a little bit about you and how you got to where this amazing career. You were an undergraduate at Union College, where you were an engineering student, electrical engineering. How did a budding engineer become a law student?
Well, everything is an experience to try, and some of the things you try, you decide it wasn't for you, and some you don't. And I found engineering to be something that I was relatively good at. That's why I went into it in the first instance, and but less interesting to me than something that had a little more people activity. And for some reason, and I can't even tell you why, the spark came, let's try law, and that's what happened.
Okay, and you went to Boston College, and after graduating there with your law degree, you came to Vermont because you accepted a job with Judge Barnard Lettie as a clerk. What were the takeaways from that clerkship?
Well, it was an incredible experience because he had been a lawyer for a long time, of course, and was one of the clearly best lawyers in Vermont, and also enjoyed so much being a judge that you got both the experience of the law and the many, many, many stories. I remember he's an Irish storyteller, so the many stories about the law, and then the experience of watching the cases in the courtroom, and then watching him and how to be a judge. So it's probably the most, the most outcome determinative experience of my life.
Yeah, wow. And I just found out he was a grandfather of the current Attorney General, T.J. Donovan.
Right.
So there must have been lots of times as a lawyer in the state of Vermont and as a judge when you had to square off against people that you knew or were familiar with. So how in this kind of adversarial legal system do you deal with that kind of familiarity and relationships in one's work?
Well, that is why Vermont is a special place. Of course, given our size, of course, as a lawyer, you're working with and against people all the time, the same people. You're appearing before the same judges, and you're involved in the same kind of activities. So you learn, and this is one of the very important lessons of a young lawyer, is how to be professional, how to represent your clients, how to do the job, and on the other hand, not be uncivil, as you use the word, that is, because a lot of the system works by the ability of people to work together and not get in each other's way.
Right.
By the way, let me apologize. I'm at the end of a cold here, so you may hear a cough.
and please take water as you need it. So after
let me finish the
sure. Oh yeah, sure.
It's so hard, given how much incivility seemed to have gone into relationships these days among people, to imagine that the whole legal system in Vermont is built on civility, built on people getting along well, people who can be friends one day or can remain friends, even though they're going to be adversaries during the course.
In court.
Right, in court and in other kind of proceedings. Yeah. But Vermont, I think, has done this quite well. and ought to be a model for the rest of the country.
Okay, well put. we can only hope. So after clerking for Judge Lettie, you went on to Vermont Legal Aid, where you were deputy director and then executive director. So how did the cases that you saw at Legal Aid in the 70s affect your work?
Well, it was a time of, because of the availability of legal services for people who couldn't otherwise have afforded them. It was a time of the growth of law and that hadn't had much before that. So there were always new issues. There were new things coming along. It seemed like the cutting edge of the law, certainly to us that were in the middle of it.
Right.
So we had an opportunity to develop the law in ways that it hadn't been, even though we were comparative youngsters who were doing it. So there was a lot of feeling of accomplishment, very much so in the work. That was, I think, important, and a lot of fast growth in how to do things.
Right. For people who just didn't have the money.
Yeah, because you were thrown in at levels that probably, if you were in private practice, you wouldn't have seen for years.
Sure, fantastic. And then you went from legal aid into serving as legal counsel and administration secretary to Governor Madeline Kunin. So this was all in the mid-'80s. Remarkable job right there. What was a key lesson about government and governing during that period?
Oh, a number of things came out of it for me. Of course, with legal counsel, I was still in the law, but when I became Secretary of Administration, the law was a background, of course, that was helpful to it, but I was no longer the governor's lawyer. I was the secretary of a agency with lots of responsibilities, particularly when it came to budgeting and spending and all that sort of stuff. That's really where I've spent the most time in relation to the legislature. I've never been elected to anything, and I had never been, I had some involvement with the legislature, but not a lot, and I learned very much to respect that institution. I was so directly involved in it. There would be a day I'd be in every committee in the House or something. One of the things I used to say is I'm going to go from Committee X to Y to see what I'm saying over there, because it seemed like I was there everywhere to it. And it's a totally different experience. The experience of being a judge is you get into depth on problems, a lot of depth. The experience of being Secretary of Administration is you're touching everything, but for an average of a minute or something. So the skill really, I think, that was important to develop there is how to get into something very, very quickly, get something done relatively quickly, and then get out and move on to the next thing. And I think that was a very important skill for
a lot of things to
yes,
touch and keep going
right.
In the direction that you wanted to. So you were then appointed to the Supreme Court by Governor Kunin in 1987, and at that time education funding and environmental regulation were major issues in the legislature, and so you were certainly familiar with them, and then these are cases that came before you in the court. So how did you separate, again, that politics that you were very involved in and your work on the bench?
Well, environmental, generally you're reviewing cases that probably came out of a legal system that was different because there's always delay between when you're going to appear, deal with them on the Supreme Court and not. So I really didn't have much to do with the new legislation. And in the Kunin administration, there was quite a bit of new environmental legislation. I don't recall that there was any cases about them, at least early on. Educational financing was a bigger challenge because, of course, educational financing became a very big issue with the Kunin administration. There was a change in the formula.
Indeed.
Yes, and there was more money went into it, and there was considerable litigation and then a change thereafter. And so, yeah, I was familiar with exactly what was going on. I ended up being on the court that declared unconstitutional the formula that was developed in the Kunin administration. So I'm in the very interesting situation of declaring some of my own work unconstitutional for doing it. And in that sense, there was overlap for it. But most of it is just so different a function, and so you're addressing these questions in so different a way that it is not the continuation of a process.
So, do you have a judicial philosophy? I mean, some people would say you were an activist judge, and that's such a buzzword these days going around. What is your philosophy, and how do you react to the whole idea of activist judges?
Well, first and foremost, I'd say my philosophy is based fundamentally on responsibility for the law and the development of the law. Not one that's based on ideology. I know it's nice to characterize judges as, or justices as, are you conservative, liberal, activist, or I don't know what the opposite of activist, by the way. Inactivist? No, I can't.
Inactivist, right.
It's an odd thing to try to figure out. But I think it plays much less role than people seem to think it does in the court system, particularly in the state court system. If you're in the Supreme Court of the United States, in which every case is a constitutional case virtually, then of course the philosophy comes through more starkly. But when you're in a case in which very few actually are constitutional cases of the kind of magnitude of what you described, most of them are simply what is the law, how do we apply it in these circumstances. Under this, it's not about, gee, I want to go do a new law, it's
right.
How do we apply it right. And that's where I think my strength was over the course of the time, and the most important part of it.
Great. Justice Dooley, we are already out of time. There's so much more to visit with you about, so we are going to continue this conversation tomorrow. Thank you. We'll talk more specifically about the Vermont Constitution and other things about the law. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me again.
And thank you for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard.